what we're doing at the Southeast National Marine Renewable Energy Center is part of a broader effort that's spearheaded by the U.S. Department of Energy to develop more and a wider variety of renewable energy resources for the country's future. Our motivation here in Florida is varied, but from a Florida perspective, the important pieces of it fall under this business of economics and energy security. We use a lot of electricity in Florida. Air conditioning has become the norm. I don't know how people lived down here before air conditioning, in fact. And we use a lot of air conditioning. We use a lot of electricity, but we don't have any fuel to make that electricity, so we buy it from other states. Billions and billions of dollars go to West Virginia and Texas and Colorado, all over the place where they have these fuels. Of course, we got to get that fuel down here to put it in power plants to make electricity, and that's not very secure because the natural gas comes across the Gulf of Mexico in a couple of pipelines, which are vulnerable to events such as that one that's happening a couple hundred miles east of here. The coal, we don't use too much coal anymore. That comes down in rail cars, but there aren't very many rail lines. Those are vulnerable, not only to natural events, but also to people with nefarious political agendas. Nuclear power, nuclear fuel is a little easy to transport, but, you know, hauling around radioactive uranium in trucks is one of these things that doesn't feel very secure either. So we're motivated to try to find energy resources to make electricity in Florida that aren't so insecure and that actually will improve the economic situation here in Florida. If we can keep those billions of dollars here in Florida, we can do a lot of stuff with it. We can create jobs, for example. So where can we look for those? Now, Florida has a lot of renewable energy resources, to be sure. Wind isn't so good here except for days like today, and we hope there aren't too many of those. But we do have a lot of sunshine. It's the sunshine state, except that we have a lot of clouds also, so that, you know, out in the desert Southwest, the sun really shines, and that's where the big electricity producing potential is. We can do it here. FPL is working that one hard. Biomass, you know, growing stuff, burning it, making electricity by burning biomass is actually a real powerful thing here in Florida because we have these multiple growing seasons or the extended growing seasons. And so that's something that Central Florida in particular, if they can figure out how to convert, let's say, orange peels into something that'll burn in a power plant, then they've got something going. It'll probably smell better than coal plants anyway. So. But here in South Florida, where we use a huge amount of electricity, we also have a resource, and it's just offshore. This is the ocean here. Turns out that what we call the Florida Current, that's the piece of the Gulf Stream that's just offshore, has the potential for about 60 Turkey Point power plants of power. That's a lot of power. There's also a thermal structure offshore that offers perhaps even more potential. And we don't have to think about recovering all of it. If we just recover some of it, it'll definitely meet our needs. To go about doing this, we have to be careful, though, because the oceans are already under a lot of stress, and the last thing we need to do is exacerbate that, is to make that worse. Here's a picture of the resources that we have. The Florida Current is, you know, the Gulf Stream starts somewhere down here west of Cuba, flows up into the Gulf of Mexico, loops around, comes up through the Florida Straits between Florida and Cuba and then Florida and the Bahamas, takes off to the north. We call the Florida Current, the piece of the Gulf Stream that's here in the Florida Straits. And the power in the flow out there is equivalent to the wind power of a gale force wind. And so there's a lot of potential out there, and that's what we at the center are working on first. Our operational area is just offshore here in Dania Beach, about 12 or 15 miles offshore. That little red blob is our first operations area. You can see it's right on the edge of the strongest part of the flow, and that's intentional because we're going to start with scale model systems, and we don't want to subject them to the full flow right away. We want to work up to that. We also have a thermal resource. This picture is an east-west cross-section. Here's Florida, and here's somewhere in the Bahamas. Or no, this is about halfway to the Bahamas, I guess. And the colors represent the water temperature. And there's a process called ocean thermal energy conversion, which I'll explain if anybody asks about it, but I don't need to go into detail at this level, that can use the temperature difference between the warm water at the surface, the orange and red water, and then the cool water down deep, the blue water, to generate electricity. And we have quite a potential for OTEC here in Florida as well. This is not new. This has been around for decades, and they've been working on it in Hawaii for a long time. The cost of electricity in Hawaii is real high because they don't have fuel there either, and to get it to Hawaii is even harder than getting it to Florida, so it's expensive. But the combination of these two resources, a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, which is 1 million watts. The Turkey Point plant is about 3 1/3 of these gigawatts, and so altogether we have about 400 of them. And it turns out, altogether, that's 6 times the generating capacity of all of Florida. So there's a tremendous amount of potential for energy offshore here. Here's a little history of the center and what our role is. We started in 2007 with an award from the state of Florida. And then last summer, we were designated as one of the 3 U.S. national marine renewable energy centers by the Department of Energy. The other 2 are in Hawaii, and they're looking at OTEC, and they're looking at wave energy. And then the third one is on the northwest coast at at Oregon State University and at the University of Washington. And they're working on waves at Oregon State and on tide energy in Puget Sound at the University of Washington. The state funds that we receive, we've been leveraging with federal support. As I said at the beginning, the Department of Energy has ramped up a program to move this new technology forward, and that's what we're part of. We're working with the government, we're working with industry, and our main role is to advance the technology of marine renewable energy in the Florida current. That's where we're starting. We're going to be looking at OTEC as we go along, but because, and I'll show a little bit more about this later, because what we call hydrokinetic energy, that is to say the power of the flow itself, is something that's been worked on for quite some time recently, both in Europe and in this country. That's a bit ahead of OTEC, and so we're starting with the hydrokinetic part of it, the Florida current itself. Our role is to develop the infrastructure to create a national test facility. Building new equipment, new designs, innovations, all that stuff, to generate electricity out of the flow means prototypes, and prototypes have to be tested somewhere. And some of the big companies, the big aerospace companies that are interested in this, might have the resources to build their own testing capability, but many of the smaller companies don't. And so the Department of Energy has taken this perspective that there is a need for national test facilities, and we're developing one of those. One of the things that we've been struggling with for a couple of years is that we're the first group to try to get a federal lease for marine renewable energy on the Outer Continental Shelf. This means dealing with the federal agencies that are responsible for that. They have been responsible all along for things like oil and gas exploration. And when we started working with them, they kind of thought we were like oil and gas. We used to get forms to fill out that said, how many wells are you going to drill? You know, and, well, that's not what we're doing. As we've gone along, as we've worked with them, they've started to understand more of what this is about, and they're developing processes that are specific for the renewable energy industry. But that's the breaking ground part of it. We're sort of setting precedents for those who follow, and we're hoping that they'll have an easier time of it than we've had. As this process has proceeded, we find that we're getting calls from companies who want to come and test their stuff here, so they're lining up. We're not quite ready yet. We don't have the lease. We're getting close, but we don't have it. As soon as we get that, we'll be able to deploy some equipment and start the process. How do we get there? Well, I don't want to go into this in great detail. This is kind of technical. It turns out that for years, for decades, both NASA, the Department of Defense have been using something called technology readiness levels. This is a scale that kind of depicts that. And the levels are the numbers along this scale, and they start on the left with somebody has a bright idea, okay? And then you do things to develop it. There's basic research, and you have to define things, and you have to explore the feasibility and proof of concept. And as you go along, you get to the point where eventually, if you succeed, you open a store that says, "Fighter jets are us," or something like that, because it's a commercial. You can actually, sell these things commercially. The big aerospace companies sell it to the Department of Defense, of course. Somebody's been selling NASA rockets for years, obviously, but this is the way they've developed it. And the Department of Energy has adopted this approach for marine renewable energy. The point of showing this is to illustrate this comment that it starts with. Wind power's been around for a long time, for decades and decades. And it's about 30 or 35 years ahead of us. Wave and tidal power have been around, especially in Europe, for a long time as well. And they're maybe 10 or 15 years ahead of us. And the illustration here is that that's not only true in terms of time, it's true in terms of these technology readiness levels. So we're somewhere down here in the discovery and concept definition and feasibility part of the problem. The people who are working on wave and tidal energy are actually doing open water validation now. There's a test center in Europe for that purpose. Of course, the wind people are in the commercial deployment stage. There's a company out in Colorado called Vestas that just got an order from FPL's parent company for 200 more wind turbines. It's a commercial operation out there. So we're just getting started in all this, is one of the reasons that there hasn't been a lot of sort of splashy news about it. Well, where are we? Gabe, I think you're going to do a tour.
Yes.
And show them the yellow thing there, right? Okay. So you're going to see this stuff up in the upper right-hand corner shortly. This is a computer-controlled dynamometer. One of the components of a generating system is the electromechanical generator itself. And it's turned by a big rotor, like a windmill rotor, that the current pushes and turns. And because the generator is a component of the underwater system, we have to have a way to test it as well. And so that's what the purpose of that laboratory facility is. When we get to putting things at sea, our strategy is to deploy, and this is what the lease is for, our strategy is to deploy an instrumented mooring buoy out about 12 miles offshore on an anchor and leave it there. And then when we want to test equipment, we go out and hook up to this. It's an attachment point for the testing process. We have this thing built. These are real pictures of the sea trials. We're fine-tuning it so it doesn't do something untoward like, sink. But it's actually almost complete. We're also building an experimental system for ourselves to test so we can figure out what to do and how to have operations that work. And that's about 50% complete at this stage. What this is going to look like, ultimately, is here's a picture of the experimental system. This is the rotor, the propeller part that the current turns, and then the generator itself are all contained in this housing. This is a configuration that is to be towed, and like in this cartoon, where you take a boat out, you hook it up to that buoy I described, which is on an anchor, and it just sits there in the Florida current in the Gulf Stream, and then you lower the system off the back of the boat, and it sits in the current and turns, and you generate electricity and you test it out. It's set up with weights on the bottom to first of all, hold it down, because after all, you're pulling this up. And second of all, to stabilize it so that when the rotor turns, it doesn't flip it over. We're going to be, as soon as we get this thing completed, we're going to be testing it by towing it behind the boat. And then ultimately, we'll take the boat out and hook it up to the mooring. After that, we can develop a second kind of configuration of the same system with floats. so that it actually is buoyant and it can be hooked directly to this anchor line and generate electricity underwater all by itself. It doesn't have to be hooked onto a boat and lowered from a boat. Ultimately, the configuration for commercial systems will be somewhat more like this, with underwater systems that operate autonomously. The electricity they generate would be conducted by a cable down the anchor line to some other cables on the sea bottom and then brought to shore. So this is the concept of the whole thing. As I said, we're starting out with smaller systems. This is about 10 feet in diameter, this propeller, this rotor. We think probably companies are going to be developing full-scale systems that are maybe 10 times that big. And then to generate the kinds of power that we're talking about, maybe to generate a Turkey Point plant's worth of power, they would have to deploy perhaps 1,000 or 1,500 of these things out in the Gulf Stream in a kind of array. And so that's part of the overall development of these technology readiness levels to commercial readiness. Throughout all of this, and this goes back to the very first slide where I talked about how are we going to do this very carefully. Throughout all of this, we have to pay attention to the ocean itself. We have to pay attention to the environment. And the challenge is to address the question of can we recover energy on these scales in the context of environmental stewardship. And that breaks down into two related things. One has to do with the environmental concerns that are specific to the ocean out there. What are we going to do to the ocean and the critters in it? And the other perspective has to do with the environmental benefits of implementing this. There's a trade-off involved. And the balance of, where this trade-off balances is going to determine the future of what this is all about. Because we're in the early stages of it, we don't know the answers to a lot of the questions about the environmental concerns. And part of our strategy is to use that mooring buoy as an experimental platform to gather data about the ocean to answer those questions. So we'll see if we find any showstoppers as we go along. But there's no other way to get the data that we need to answer the questions than to go out and make measurements. So that's part of our plan. That's part of our strategy. We're also working on the issue of, suppose all this goes. Suppose we don't send billions of dollars to West Virginia and Texas and Colorado and places like that. And we have a new industry here to assemble, to build, to deploy, to maintain all these bits of equipment that are out there in the ocean. Well, we're going to need a workforce to do that. So we started to address that question with a curriculum that we developed, and it's the first shot is kind of middle school, high school level material. We've been training teachers. We've been having workshops where we bring teachers in and we run them through the curriculum. This is a piece of it here. Here's a middle school kid. I figure if we can get middle school kids who wear their hair that way interested in science and engineering, then we've really got something, And he's fascinated by this little experiment where you take a hairdryer and you suspend a ping pong ball over it, right? You can do this at home. Put the hairdryer on the cool setting because ping pong balls do burn. But you can do this and, impress yourself with the Bernoulli effect. But there's all sorts of bits and pieces in this curriculum that pull together physics and engineering and environmental things. And it's an interesting introduction to a wide variety of science topics with an application that's caught everybody's imagination. So, as I said, we're just getting started on this. We're moving ahead as fast as sort of the funding stream will allow us to. And we're having the tests of the mooring buoy that you guys did were actually most impressive. So I'm pretty optimistic about where we're going. This is the material, this is the slides you have, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any.